Oh, hello. You caught me reading this book that I think has your professor's name on it. It's Gender and Pop Culture. I think that's my name. You know what? That's embarrassing. I'll read something a little less. Oh, I also have this book here. I think that's my name on it again. You know what? I'm so sorry, you guys. I'm so sorry. This is so embarrassing and so just blatantly. What is this? This is a book about Beyonce with your professor's name on it. Oh my God, we must be talking about gender this time. Because look, I got these books that I've written on gender, and I've been alone on stay at home for COVID-19 for a long time. So I'm making this video for you. Let's talk about gender, which happens to be one of my favorite lectures because I kind of published in it. You know, just a few books, like, I don't know, 9, whatever, who's counting? Let's talk about gender. All right. So, gender socialization. So, here is what gender is. So gender is not necessarily something we are. Gender is what's called a system of beliefs and practices. It's something that we think and something that we do, and it is something that is taught to us, right? So we talked about social construction of race, the way we have decided as a society what race is, based off of our real or perceived differences. The exact same thing applies for gender. With gender, we have decided what is male and what is female in our society. And we've also decided on just those two terms, male and female, which I'll get to in a second, addressing that. But gender is something that we think and something that we do. One of the first studies that really kind of looked at gender. So sociology, remember I said, has been around since the 1830s. The study of gender has not really taken flight until maybe the late 1970s, definitely not until the 80s, which makes it a really, really young really young subject or area for a discipline like sociology that's been around for over 100 years, almost 200 years at this point. Gender is really young, which means that it's studying it has happened very fast and still has a ton of ground to cover. But one of the first studies was a study called Doing Gender that came out in 1987 by these two people, West and Zimmerman. And one of the things that they addressed in the study is that gender is something that we do. So gender is a performance. We are all performing our gender all the time. From the way you choose to wear your hair, if you put on makeup or not, what clothes you wear, all of this signals to the world, hey, I'm male or I'm female. We also assign gender to absolutely almost everything in our lives. We can assign gender to. Like some of you have maybe even like named or gendered your cars or like inanimate objects that you really like. If you watch Queer Eye on Netflix, you'll see that they use the word she a lot for all sorts of things, not just people. We assign gender to everything, the clothes we wear, right? When you go into a store, you often see the male and female section, and that is because we have decided that these are the clothes for men and these are the clothes for women. We assign gender to activities, right? So there's a reason why whenever a girl makes it onto a football team, that usually that becomes news in whatever town she lives in, because we look at football as a male sport. It's something that is for men. Same thing with boys who decide that they want to do things like dance. We have sort of decided that this is a female thing for women or for girls, and that for boys, it's kind of odd if a boy wants to be a ballerina. That's not my opinion. It's just sort of an example. I think if boys want to be a ballerina, go for it. We've also assigned gender to our dispositions, right? Like men are expected to be tall and muscular and beefy and have all sorts of like super chiseled looks, and women should be petite and small and kind of stay within that small category for most of their lives, maybe with the exception of when they're pregnant. But even then, there's an expectation that women get their body back right away, right? So with feminist theory, you have the definition of it, which is over here, an analysis of sexism. This is from when we're looking at gender specifically. Feminist theory wants to analyze sexism and strategies for challenging patriarchy and present new ways of social interaction. So a lot of times when I say patriarchy, people immediately think, oh, this is all about hating men, or this is all about excluding men and just having a world full of women. That's not what it is at all. Patriarchy just means a male-dominated society, and patriarchy harms men in different ways, but also is harmful to men in the same way that it's harmful to women. For women, patriarchy kind of creates this society where women are secondary and their needs are secondary, and Looking at things through a feminine lens is seen as weak or not great. But for men, it's also is equally harmful because it teaches men and boys that they can't cry, that they can't show emotions, that being a great father should be second to being a great provider, and puts a lot of responsibility on men to be in charge of the family. And that's not great for men either. So challenging patriarchy means just challenging gender norms. So here's an example. I was listening to a podcast this morning that was talking about countries that are dominated by women, meaning that they have a woman president or a woman prime minister, that a lot of these countries, you're seeing them change the idea of a 9-to-5 workday. I saw this when I was in Denmark. People there tend to work from 7:30 until 2 or 2:30, which is the exact same time that children are in school. So countries that have women in charge are looking at things like the workday a little bit differently and saying, hey, if we're going to have kids, which we need to have to, keep going as a society, we need to think about when people are at work and when people are in school. This eliminates the need for after-school daycare. It eliminates a lot of stress on the parent because they don't have to figure out who is going to pick up and drop off at what time while they're at work, and who's going to be in charge of what. This is looking at things through a more feminist approach. Okay, so feminist theory, when we talk about this, we also talk about a term called intersectionality. And this word has become a little bit more mainstream as we have come through the last probably, I'd say, like 5 to 10 years. Intersectionality was coined by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And essentially what it says is that oppression is interconnected. So people are oppressed, yes, by race, class, gender, etc., but rarely do we see oppression existing with just one of those things, that they're interlocked. That if you're going to be oppressed based on race, you're probably going to be oppressed based off of something else. So for example, if I am an African-American woman, and it is more difficult for me to find a job, which is just a fact, it would be, I am looking at oppression not just on race and not just on gender, but on a combination of both of those things. Intersectionality is sort of the first way that we've started to look at oppression combining all of the ways that people are oppressed: age, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, disability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So take a second and pause me. And in this week's module, around this lecture, you'll see a video that I've labeled Kimberly Crenshaw. Take a minute, watch what she has to say about intersectionality, and then come back to me. I will do the Star Trek until you come back. All right, are you back? Okay, the other thing I have on here is a quote by Audre Lorde. And she's saying there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Meaning that we can't just say we are going to achieve racial harmony for everybody and suddenly life is going to be amazing and everything's going to be great. Because we don't live a single issue life. We as a society can't solve one of our problems without looking at all of them as a whole. And I talked about this in the first lecture when I said sociology doesn't exist independently of itself. You have to take in all of the problems and put them together and look at them kind of under one microscope with multiple lenses. Okay. So when we're talking about gender, we talk about what's called the gender binary, which basically is a two-gender system. So gender binary means that we look at gender in terms of two things, male and female, and we don't challenge that. So if someone doesn't fit into that gender binary, meaning they don't look or act male, they don't look or act what we see as female, then we say they've challenged our gender binary and they've challenged gender norms. Now, is this a great system? No, it's not. One of the mistakes people tend to make is that I'm saying that, society should be just male and female. That's not what this is saying at all. In fact, it's saying it's a problem that we look at gender just in terms of male or female, and not in terms of the spectrum of where people could identify based on gender. This is where we start to say masculine women and feminine men just don't fit into that binary. And what do we do now, right? This is where you see society really just start to kind of throw its hands up and say, what are we supposed to do? And clutches their pearls and all of that stuff. So what I want to do with most of lecture today is I want to take you through a history of feminism and a history of the study of gender. So remember I said this is approximately since 1970. But what we have had is a buildup to 1970 and then kind of an explosion and then a buildup since then. So I want to kind of take you through those different stages. The study of gender, like I said, is really young, but the history of gender equality goes back as far as this woman. So this is Mary Wollstonecraft. So Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 wrote a pamphlet. So pamphlets in 1792 were like 100 pages long, because what else did you have to do? You didn't have like a phone. You couldn't be like, let me scroll through Wikipedia and study gender. She wrote a pamphlet called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And the Vindication of the Rights of Women was considered one of the first documents that made an argument for women to have equality, to be equal to men. One of the arguments she made in it was that, she was really trying to like appeal to the lowest common sensibility of people. So she said, hey, husbands, if you want your wives to be fun at parties, let her have an education because she'll have more things to talk about. Lowest common denominator, but not a bad argument. So a vindication of the rights of women is kind of when we say, where did the study of gender start? A lot of people point to Mary Wollstonecraft. Also, fun fact and trivia that got me a free hamburger at Hamburger Mary's trivia night is Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of Mary Shelley. Now, raise your hand if you know who Mary Shelley is. Hold on, I'll give you a second. Oh, that's right. Mary Shelley wrote the book Frankenstein. So Mary Wollstonecraft died in childbirth, giving birth to Mary Shelley. She died in her 30s, giving birth to Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley took that trauma that she had experienced, I don't know if she remembered it, but took the trauma of losing her mother. And they say that was the inspiration for Frankenstein, this creation of this monster. And if you read Frankenstein and A Vindication of the Rights of Women kind of at the same time, you can start to see the themes of Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, in her own work. So, piece of trivia for you, might get yourself a free hamburger or veggie burger, whatever works for you. So when we're talking about feminism is defined as coming in waves, like literally a wave, right? Like literally how waves flow in and flow out. We talk about feminism in the same way. The first wave is from 1848 to 1920. If you need to jot that down, first wave of feminism, 1848 to 1920. And this is when women were trying to get the right to vote. So in 1848, you had a group of women get together at what was called the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, women and men, I should say. And they sat down and they said, okay, how are we going to get women the right to vote? What are we going to do? And after 2 days of speeches and talking, they emerged with what they called the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, if you have some time, Google the Declaration of Sentiments. It is phenomenal. And especially if you like history, it is fascinating to read through the requests that they had. But they came through with the Declaration of Sentiments that they saw as the gender version of the Declaration of Independence. So some of the people that were there were people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. These were two of the kind of main heavy hitters with the first wave of feminism. Another woman who was there, or who was fighting for suffrage or for women to get the right to vote, was Sojourner Truth. Now, Sojourner Truth was a freed slave. And she spent most of her life after she was freed speaking about suffrage and also trying to find her children. She had 13 children while she was enslaved, and she lost all of them. So she spent her time doing those two things, which you have to think this was in like 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. It must have been so hard for her to be able to find her children. It's not like she could go on Facebook, right, and just start looking for people. Sojourner Truth comes in as an interesting character at this point in history because one of the main debates that was happening was, do we get the right to vote for all women, white women, black women, women of color? Do we do it for everybody, or do we give it to white women first? And then white women can then work to get the vote for women of color. And this was a real debate. Some women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of them, fell into the camp of, we got to get the right to vote for white women, and then everybody else will fall in line. Other folks said, no, that does not sound great, because how are we going to trust you to get us the right to vote, right? Sojourner Truth watched this happen, and she made a famous speech in the 1850s called Ain't I a Woman? So what I want you to do is pause me, go back to Canvas, look for the link that says Ain't I a Woman, and watch the video. You're going to see Kerry Washington from Scandal. I loved Scandal. I don't know about you guys. You're going to see Kerry Washington perform Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech. So pause me. Okay. Wasn't that great? So Sojourner Truth spoke her mind about, women of color are no different than women, right, in general. So the most famous suffragette, if there is such thing as a famous suffragette, is probably Susan B. Anthony. So Susan B. Anthony was also at Seneca Falls. She worked throughout most of her life to get women the right to vote. I have this on here somewhere, in 1872, she tried to vote in the presidential election, and she was arrested because it was illegal for women to vote. She was arrested and she was put in jail for quite some time, and she was jailed quite a bit for trying to get women the right to vote. Now, at this point in history, if you wanted to protest something, you would make a sign. So here we have a sign that these women have with Susan B. Anthony's quote on it. These women have sewn the sign because no marker boards. They sew signs onto sheets or letters onto sheets. And at this point in history, you could go and stand outside of the Oval Office, and the president would have to walk past you on his way to work. So he would walk past protesters on his way to work. Can you imagine that now in 2020? There's no way. It would never happen. But at this point in history, you could. So women started to try to get the right to vote, beginning at the Seneca Falls Convention, all the way through Susan B. Anthony's life. She died in, I think, 1906, which is down here. By 1906, women still hadn't gotten the right to vote. But one of the cool things that happens every year during an election is women take their I voted stickers and they leave it on Susan B. Anthony's tomb, which is in upstate New York in Rochester. So all the way through to 1906, throughout her entire life, she tries to get women the right to vote. It doesn't happen, obviously. But what does happen is new generations of women start to pick up this mantle and pick up this thing and try and carry it through to the finish line. So we now land around 1910 with Alice Paul. Now, if you were in a class right now, I would say, hey, what's going on in 1910 that's so important in the world? And I would wait for you to say World War I, right? So during World War I, the president at the time said, hey, it's unpatriotic to protest during a wartime. And anyone who's protesting right now is against the United States. And he made declarations and all of that. This did not stop the suffragettes. The suffragettes said, I don't care. We're going to the Oval Office. We got our sheet with our sign on it, and we're going to stand here and protest. So what happened? They were arrested. They were arrested for charges like blocking a sidewalk or taking space on the street, and they were put in jail. Now, this is where things get a little complicated or a little tricky. How many of you have seen Mary Poppins, like the first one? Raise your hands. Okay, if you have not, sometime at the end of class today, maybe go watch at least through this scene again. It's on Disney streaming. Because there's a scene and there's an entire song about women getting the right to vote. And the mom comes down and she's got her cute little Votes for Women sash and she's got her little umbrella and she's very like, I'm going to get women the right to vote today. And da, 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 da. And she's got a whole song about women in it. That's kind of the picture we're painted when we talk about women getting the right to vote, but that's not entirely what happened. It was actually a really brutal part of our history that gets sort of washed over. So when women were arrested for blocking the sidewalk or the street, they were put in jail. And they had made a pact amongst themselves that they were not going to bend. They were not going to give in. So what they did instead was they said, all right, we're in jail. We're going to sit here. We're not going to leave. This angered the people who had jailed them. So they started to retaliate against the women. And they would do things like pick one of them who they thought was the weakest or who would get the most emotion from the women and hang her by her hands in the center of the jail. Like literally kick something up from under her feet and have her hanging there strung up by her hands. And they would leave her there thinking that the women would say, okay, enough is enough. Please stop torturing our friend. They would go on hunger strikes and say, we're not going to eat until you let us have the right to vote. So the jailers would take tubes and shove them down their throats, and then they would take raw eggs and just start shoving them into each woman's body. This was a brutal point in our history, and Alice Paul was leading the charge for a lot of this time. Okay, so all of this happens. World War I happens. The end of World War I comes. The president signals that he is starting to become okay with women getting the right to vote. And suffragettes sort of move forward with trying to get the Constitution ratified. Now, for those of you who have not had American government, or those of you who have had, what do we need to have an amendment to the Constitution? How many states? That's right, 2/3. Okay, so in 1920, in August of 1920, one of the last states to try and get this passed through was Tennessee. And it was kind of like if Tennessee said no, then women getting the right to vote was dead in the water. So this guy, Harry Byrne, was a state senator from Tennessee, and he was all set to vote no. And he was kind of one of the deciding votes. And his vote would have put suffrage just down the drain, would not have happened. Women would not have gotten the right to vote. So he's getting all set to vote. And eventually, during the voting, he has passed a note, and the note is from his mother. So he reads the note and he folds it up and he puts it in his pocket. And right then and there, he changes his vote. He votes yes, and women receive the right to vote. So years later, like I want to say mid to late 2010s, people found out what that note said. And the note from his mother, here she is, her name was Feb. The note was from his mother, and it basically said, Viva suffrage, be a good boy, vote for Miss Paul's amendment. And because she wrote that note, women got their right to vote. Not something we talk about a lot in history, but Feb Byrne should get a lot more credit than what she has. Okay, so we have the end of World War I. Women get the right to vote. We're moving through the 1930s and 40s. What's happening in the U.S. then? World War II, that's right. What happened to women during World War II? Women worked in factories while men were out fighting. Then the 1950s happened, and women were told, okay, go back home, take care of children. This didn't settle well for a lot of women who had jobs and college degrees and experience. Betty Friedan was one of those women. Betty Friedan in the 60s was a journalist, and when she got pregnant with her second kid, she was fired from her job for being pregnant, which was completely legal at the time and something that a lot of people saw as totally acceptable. She was fired. She went home and she became a stay-at-home mom taking care of her children. Pretty quickly, she started to feel like things were not great and that she wanted to be doing something else with her life. So she started talking to her neighbors and saying, hey, I feel a little restless. I feel like there should be something else happening in my life that's not happening in my life. What do you think? And her neighbors started to agree and say, yeah, something's not right. I don't feel right. At the time in the 60s, Betty Friedan called this the problem that had no name. At the time in the 60s, you saw an increase in alcohol abuse and drug abuse, particularly for women who were staying at home with children. Now, I get it, children are stressful. But the drug abuse stemmed from husbands, because at that point in time, a husband could walk into a pharmacy and say, or into a doctor's office, and say, my wife, there's just something not right. There's just something off about her. She's not as fun as she used to be, or she's not as energetic as she used to be. Is there something you can give her? And the doctor, without seeing the wife or speaking to her, could say to the husband, oh yeah, give her this. So the doctor would prescribe a pill that became known as Mother's Little Helper. Now, if you want a fun Friday night, here's a tip from me to you. Google ads from the 50s and 60s for Mother's Little Helper, the pill. You will be shocked at the way that this was advertised to people, or maybe you won't be. It was like the magic pill that was going to make your wife amazing again. So Betty Friedan called this state the problem that has no name, and she ended up writing a book published in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And in The Feminine Mystique, she chronicled how women were feeling these levels of anxiety of not having to do what they want to do, not having careers, not having jobs, not that they don't love their families and love their children and all of that, but there was something else they wanted to be doing with their life. This book sold like the seventh Harry Potter book. Like this book sold like nothing anyone had seen, and every woman was reading this book. Also in the 60s, we get Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem is probably known as the founding mother of feminism. If you are interested, you can watch the series Mrs. America, which is on Hulu now. It was on FX. And it sort of takes you through some of Gloria Steinem's life and a lot of this point in history. Gloria Steinem became known as one of the founding mothers of feminism because she was a journalist and she started writing and speaking out about feminism and about women's rights. And she was one of the most prolific, and she still is one of the most prolific writers on gender that you could probably find. If you're not familiar with her, please take a second and look her up. So these are some of the achievements. These are some of the achievements of the second wave. This is just a few of them. One of them is birth control became legal. Women could get credit in their own name. Before the late 1970s, if you were a woman and you wanted to get a mortgage and you wanted to get a credit card, anything, a car, you had to have your husband, your father, or your brother sign for you. You could not sign on your own. If you could at all, you couldn't apply for credit. You could get a bank account and mortgage in your own name, something else that didn't happen prior to the 70s. Title IX was passed. Some of you probably know Title IX as the gender equity for sports laws. It's also what protects you on like college campuses from sexual harassment and sexual assault. It became illegal for employers to fire somebody because they were pregnant. Sexual assault and sexual harassment laws were written, although those weren't enacted for another 20 years. And interracial marriage became legal. If you're not familiar with the case of Loving versus Virginia, please look it up. It's a fascinating story of how an interracial couple fought the system in, I think it was Mississippi in the 60s. Mississippi in the 60s being an interracial couple, and how that became a Supreme Court case that changed the way that interracial marriage was seen. All right, third wave. So we've gone through the 60s and 70s. Sorry, just moved myself very quickly. Third wave is from 1992 to around 2010. So during this time, around in 1992, well, let me back up. In the 80s, feminism sort of took a break, and a lot of it was put on hold. A lot of this had to do with because of the politics of the time. A lot of this had to do with people really starting to study it, and it sort of retreated into the university. In 1992, in the United States, we were looking to confirm a new Supreme Court justice named Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was going to be only the second African-American person to be placed on the Supreme Court. So this was a huge deal. And he was being placed on the court by President Bush Sr., not Jr. So President Bush Sr. selected him. He had gone through the process of being vetted. Clarence Thomas did. But during that process, so vetting basically means like learning everything you can about somebody. During that process, it became kind of clear that Clarence Thomas had, in his past, sexually harassed some of the women that worked for him. But the committee that was looking into that sort of said, you know what, this guy is going to be the next Supreme Court justice. Sweep it under the rug. Let's forget about it. Except one person on the committee was not cool with forgetting about it. So what they did was they slipped a little tidbit to one of the newspapers. I believe it was the Washington News. I don't remember which one. Slipped a little tidbit to a newspaper and said, hey, you might want to check into Clarence Thomas. There's something there about him that's a little bit off. And what they found was that, of course, that he had been accused of sexual harassment. And they found a woman named Anita Hill. So this is not Anita Hill. This is Rebecca Walker. Anita Hill was an employee of his. She had worked with him at the Department of Education before she had gone off and sort of done her own thing. She was an attorney. She was very accomplished. At the time when they found her, she was teaching law, I think, at the University of Oklahoma. And with Anita Hill, they had found that she had claimed sexual harassment against him several times. And this is where things get gross. So if you were tuning me out or not listening, wake up. This is where things get a little weird real fast. So she had reported that he asked her out and she would say no. he would say to her, well, I'm the best sex you'll ever have. Now, ladies, you know that when someone says that, you're like, yeah, great, sure. And then when that didn't work, he started to explicitly describe what his penis looked like and the number of women he had slept with. Now, keep in mind, at the time, he was married. Of course he was. He was married and saying these things. And when she kept turning him down, he got more aggressive. So when she would come into his office to have meetings with him, he would have porn playing on a TV in the background. So they would have meetings with porn on the television, or he would start the meeting that way. Now, historical purposes, the name of the porn was Long Dong Silver. So gross, I know. When that didn't work, he got even more aggressive. And one of the famous things that came from all of this was he would ask her to go to the fridge to get him a can of Coke, and she would. And when she would get there, she would discover that he had put his pubic hair on the top of the Coke can. I'm pausing for those of you that need to let out a oh, because it's gross, right? It's so gross. But these were the things that he had done. So when people investigated and found this, they said this woman has to come before the confirmation committee and testify, and she did. If you look in under this lecture in the Canvas module, you will find a short clip of her testimony. A lot of people years later, when Christine Blasey Ford testified in 2017 during the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh as Supreme Court Justice, a lot of people compared Anita Hill to Christine Blasey Ford because you had two women coming forward to talk about really, really painful experiences that they had had at the helm of going against the dominant culture, right? So we've talked about dominant culture. All right, so Anita Hill does this testimony, and at the time, Rebecca Walker, who I have a picture of, was a student at Yale. Now, Rebecca Walker comes into the picture because Rebecca Walker is the daughter of Alice Walker. Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple, and Rebecca Walker is a writer on her own. People start asking her, hey, what do you think about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill? Does this mean that we're in a post-feminist state? And she said, no, we're in a third wave of feminism. So when people talk about the third wave of feminism, we say that it starts in 1992 with Rebecca Walker saying, nope, we've started a third wave until about 2010 or so. Also in the third wave, one of the books that kind of defined that era, and if you like this stuff, I can't recommend it enough, is a book called Manifesta. It's gone through a couple of different iterations. There was a new version released, I think, in 2019 that you can look at. So this is the third wave. And within the third wave of feminism, you get a lot of building on what women or people in the second wave had done in terms of like equality, equal rights, pay, sorry, it completely escaped me. Equality, equal rights, pay, sexual assault, sexual harassment. You see a lot of that happening, but you also see kind of a more focus on international and women of color experiences that translate into what we call the fourth wave, which currently people say we're in the fourth wave. Some people say this began with the election of President Obama and having an African-American family in the White House. The fourth wave focuses on things like international women's rights, sexual violence, the rights of women of color, so that intersectionality piece that I was talking about comes in here, as well as the fourth wave birthed the Women's March on Washington, and the rise of technology and the use of hashtags as sort of activism. The other thing that happened with fourth wave is that we start to see feminism reflected in our culture quite a bit more, right? So you have Beyonce standing in front of a feminist sign at the VMAs. You have people like Amy Poehler. If you have Instagram, she has a page called Smart Girls, where she's bringing in STEM and smart girls around the world to the Instagram page. You have characters that were created like Olivia Pope, right? This really outspoken feminist woman. Okay, so that's your history of feminism. That's a little bit of a lecture on gender. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm just going to go back to some really interesting reading here. I don't know. It's popped into my mind. It's something great to read. Bye.